All right, so you've probably heard of the concept leveraging the long tail. It's been around for a while, but let me just quickly tell you what it is. In essence, it's about this. The cost for a company to provide a hit product, a product that's very popular, that cost in relation to the cost of providing a product that's not a hit, a product that's not so popular, a sort of niche product. Okay? The difference between these two costs, the cost of providing a product that's very popular and the cost of providing a product that's not very popular, that difference is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. Okay? Making it viable, making it feasible to actually provide products that are not very, very popular. This is the long tail. Stick around and we'll talk more about this. So I've read the book The Long Tail by Chris Anderson. The book is subtitled Why the Future of Business is Selling Less of More. Completely counterintuitive, but let's quickly unwrap that. What he means is this: to sell less in quantity of more of different kinds of items. Okay? Selling less of each kind of item while you at the same time sell a wider range of items. So still equaling up to a lot of sales. So let me be honest to you about this book. This book is interesting from a content perspective. The idea is fantastic and the examples in the book are super interesting. But from a book perspective, from a reading perspective, I have to be honest, it was actually quite cumbersome to struggle through at some points. So it sort of feels like one of these books where the author has a single great idea and try to sort of stretch that idea out as far as possible and punch as many pages as possible out of it. To me, it would have been much more valuable if the author would have just sort of given a few good examples, explained the notion perfectly, and then just cut, and then just say like, okay, this is a short book, no worries. All right, but unfortunately it's sort of blabbity blab and sort of just goes on and goes on. Either way, stick with me, the content is super interesting and the idea is highly relevant. So let me start off by giving you one of the examples of what he calls the 98% rule. So you might have already heard about the 80-20 rule, often used in business as a sort of rule of thumb. The rule sort of says that 80% of your profits come from 20% of your customers. And it's used in a lot of contexts. So it's also used as in that 80% of your revenue comes from 20% of the items that you are selling. I mean 20% as in the kinds of items you are selling. So that if you're selling a whole range of books, for example, it would be 20% of those books that constitute 80% of your actual revenue. Okay? It's the idea of that some things are popular, and it's the things that are popular that really makes you the biggest, greatest share of your money. So I think this is from an example with Amazon. It might have been somebody else, but I think it was a discussion he had with somebody from Amazon. And they were discussing how many of the items on Amazon that actually are bought. I think it was at least once or something like this. Okay? And if you think about the number of items that Amazon has, like really they have a lot of items, okay? You would think that, okay, perhaps the 80-20 rule applies here. Perhaps it's just so that 20% of the products constitute 80% of the revenue, right? So like even if it's, given that it's the internet, perhaps we could guess that it's 50%, it's 60%. Okay? Since I've already given you the number 98%, it's obvious to you perhaps that the answer was 98%. So 98% of the products on Amazon, if this particular example was Amazon. I think it was Amazon, but 98% of the products were actually sold once, which is absurd. Okay? And this is the long tail. This is why he says that we have to rethink this 80-20 rule. Okay? We can't just say that, okay, given that 80% of my revenue comes from 20% of the products, I can scrap the rest of the 80% products, that other 80%. Okay? This is not entirely valid anymore. Because if 98% of the products are selling, there's a lot of revenue to gain from jumping into or monetizing this long tail, this sort of more obscure market of products from the sidelines. So before we dive into the one-liners of this book, let me just quickly again sort of explain what the long tail is about and why it's called the long tail. So if you imagine yourself a sort of curve, I have to draw this in the other direction. If you imagine yourself a curve, right? Like there's the x-axis and there's the y-axis. So on the x-axis you have different products, and on the y-axis you have popularity. So on the x-axis we have products, and on the y-axis we have popularity. So if I now draw a curve, it would be, in the beginning, there's a very few number of products that are very, very, very popular. Okay, so we start off very high on the y-axis, but then quickly it drops, right? It drops very quickly because there's only a very few number of items that are really popular. Like, I mean, think Harry Potter or 50 Shades of Grey or Lord of the Rings, or I mean these kind of mass market super popular products, or like Apple products, or etc., etc. So but then very quickly we're dropping down, and then there's a whole lot of products that are only interesting for a bunch of niche markets. Okay, the point of understanding the long tail, or to understand the long tail, we have to understand that we are very different as people, and there's very few things that nobody are interested in. There's just very few people interested in some of these obscure things. But we have to go very, very obscure before there's nobody interested. Okay? So if I draw the tail, it's very, very long, right? Like it's closing in on zero, but it takes a long, long time before we're actually going to hit zero. Okay, so the curve is something like this. Okay, we start off very high, we quickly drop, and then it takes a long, 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 long time before we actually end up at zero. All right, so that's the curve, and I guess from statistics, or like whenever you're working with curves, this is what's called a long tail. Like this curve has a long tail. So that's why this concept is called the long tail. Anyways, let's get into some of the one-liners from this book. One-liner is, a long tail is just culture unfiltered by economic scarcity. A long tail is culture unfiltered by economic scarcity. Okay, let's unwrap this. What is economic scarcity? So be aware that I'm not an economist, but I'm sort of speculating on what seems reasonable. If you check Wikipedia, Wikipedia says that scarcity is the fundamental economic problem of having seemingly unlimited human wants in a world of limited resources. Okay? Unlimited human wants in a world of limited resources. And this kind of makes sense, right? If you think about your own life, it's hard for us as humans to be satisfied. There's always the notion of more. There's infinite demand. We can always think of something else that we want. But then we live in a physical world constituted of atoms where we can only divide these between us. We cannot create new atoms as far as we know. I mean, I shouldn't get into these kind of topics now. But we have to divide the resources, and they're scarce. Okay, we have to divide them somehow. And I guess this is how economic systems comes into the picture of which economic system, which model should we use in order to divide these resources as equally or philosophically, or to the greatest satisfaction as possible, greatest level of satisfaction as possible. Okay, so what he's saying is that a long tail is just culture unfiltered by economic scarcity. And what's culture? I mean, so again, I'm not an anthropologist, but I would assume that culture is the sort of collective habits and behaviors that we have as humans, or conduct as humans. Okay, so this obviously is taking a stand sort of outside the bounds of economics. He's saying that the long tail is sort of just a manifestation of the fact that our culture is insanely complex, but it's limited by economic scarcity, right? We want to do a lot of things, but economic scarcity is binding us, right? It's limiting us. Here's another one-liner that sort of goes into the same area. He says, "The true shape of demand is revealed only when consumers are offered infinite choice." The true shape of demand is revealed only when consumers are offered infinite choice. Okay? I don't want to sort of get into the philosophical discussion of manufactured demand, right? Of whether demand is something that exists or whether demand can be manufactured by, say, marketing. Okay? It feels like he's taking a stand in this discussion by sort of pointing towards that demand demand exists as something sort of within us that we want to manifest outwardly, and not necessarily that it's forced upon us by marketing forces, for example. I don't mean that he's taking an obvious stand, but it seems like he's taking some kind of stance, okay? So it seems like he's saying that demand, the true shape of demand, okay? The actual demand, not the limited form of demand, the actual demand in the world, can only be understood, can only be revealed, can only be completely shown when consumers are offered infinite choice. There has to be infinite choice before we can really see what people want. Okay, from their own perspectives. What do I want? Okay? Otherwise, we're limited. Otherwise, we're limited by supply. Demand is limited by supply. Demand is limited by economic scarcity. Okay? Super interesting thoughts, right? Like these are obviously shifts of the economic landscape, sort of shifts of culture. Like culture will could potentially manifest itself differently as supply increase, right? As supply increase towards the infinite, right? Philosophically, this is sort of interesting to think about. Okay, so another one-liner that's mentioned in this book is that special is the new normal. Okay? Super funny. I think I'm paraphrasing him here, but he's sort of making the case or arguing the case that this whole notion of mass marketing or mass media or the fact that like we all watch the same TV shows or like the same products or use the same products, like that's sort of a new phenomenon. And if you think about music, for example, right? Before the record, right? Like before we had the possibility to record audio, you might have heard about some band from another location. Think of the time before radio, right? Like you might have heard of a band from another town that you wouldn't actually have heard that band before they come to your town, right? Like it would be, we would be way more specialized. And if you continue this thought, if you continue on the idea of, so if you think about the radio, for example, right? Think of the shift that the radio caused. Like That's really sort of mass media, right? Think of the time when radio was new and there was only a couple of channels or programs, or I guess channels. Naturally, people listen to the same thing, right? Like the radio was a fantastic invention, and since there's only a few programs, obviously we listen to the same things, right? And if you put that into contrast with the time before that, how would we have shared that kind of mass information? Right? Perhaps newspapers, I guess. But the reach of radio would be way more huge, right? And obviously this is what's happening with the internet. But anyways, the point is this, that at the time when, for example, the radio was introduced, this is when we started to move towards this sort of mass consumption, not mass consumption, but mass, everybody consuming the same things, right? This is when we started to move towards this sort of mass media kind of society, where the norm became to consume the top goods, the sort of top, not even 20%, I don't even know what the percentage, but that sort of top of the tail, right? Where like the super hit became a thing, right? Like a superstar. Like if you think of music, like the really big artists, or like the really famous movies, right? So Chris Anderson seems to argue that this is a new phenomenon, right? This is not the way we lived before that. So it's not that this is a radical shifting to the long tail. It's actually, we've spent, during the history of humanity, we've spent more time being specialized, right, than all being agreed on the same norm, right, than all consuming the same products. Okay? I mean, I guess this is, or I think this is philosophically interesting, right? When you come to think about it, of course that makes sense, right? Of course we haven't all, through the ages and ages, been consuming the same products, right? We didn't even sort of have all this information about the people around us. So anyway, another way of saying this is that he says this. He says that we're seeing a shift from mass culture to massively parallel culture. Okay? So from a world in which we all consume the same culture or share the same culture, we're moving into a state of massively parallel culture. So there would be multiple strands of culture at the same time, right? We're creating subdivisions or subcultures, right? At a scale, I was going to say never seen before, but then from this previous argument, it would seem more reasonable to say that seems to be more natural to us. Natural to us in the sense that this is what we've been doing for the longer period of human history. Okay? Super interesting. I mean, this is a sensible phenomenon. Okay, so the last point that I want to sort of dwell on about the long tail. So it seems to me that the author is taking a stand in the discussion of sort of overwhelming choice. I think there's even a TED Talk about how we can sort of be paralyzed by the extreme number of choices coming our way. Okay, if you think about this previous argument about how it's more normal, quotation marks, for us to have choice rather than to all consume the same things. Okay, and it's not really obvious that this sort of overwhelming choice actually is a problem. But let's get into his argument. So this is what he says. He says, the paradox of choice is simply an artifact of the limitations of the physical world, where the information necessary to make an informed choice is lost. Okay? Remember, his position in this is that overwhelming choice is a good thing. Not overwhelming, but his point is that it's not overwhelming. We're just misinterpreting it, and we're just not handling this amount of choice properly. Okay? Hear this again. The paradox of choice is simply an artifact of the limitations of the physical world, where the information necessary to make an informed choice is lost. Okay? I think this example sort of would show what he means. If you imagine Amazon, okay, the book part of Amazon, okay, think about the number of books that Amazon has. Massive, right? Like they have a lot of books, okay? Then you take all of those books and then you place them in a library, okay? Physical, actual library, okay? That library would be massive, okay? Like physically massive. It would take up a lot of space, okay? Perhaps you would need to have like a golf cart that you would drive to get from one place to the other because you're looking for like an obscure book. And now imagine that this massive library, or bookshop, or whatever you want to call it, this massive library lacks an ordering of books. Let's say that you would take all of the books and then you would just scramble them. Okay? Just stick one book here, one book here, one book here, etc. And then you just go on. There's no system. There's no order. It's just chaos. Okay? Think about the number of books and think about, put yourself into the situation where you want to find a particular book. Okay? Impossible, right? Not impossible, but it would take you a lot of time, right? Now instead put yourself in the situation where you don't know what book you're looking for, but you know what kind of book you're looking for. You know roughly what kind of book you're looking for, right? This is sort of where we introduce the element of choice. So you think, okay, I want a book about this and this and this, right? You want a book about the Longtail, for example, right? But you don't know the particular book. So you have to go through each and every aisle and look at every book and read on the backside of every book, etc., 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 until you sort of have enough information to make an informed decision. Okay? This would perhaps be practically impossible. It would take you like the lifetime of a human to sort of, in your head, summarize the contents of all of these, from reading the backside of all of these books. Like, it's just insane. Okay? This is the problem that he's pointing towards. It's not that it's too much choice. Okay? Too much choice is not the problem. Choice is good. The problem is that we're not good enough at figuring out how to filter, how to sort, how to serve relevant content to the person who's looking for it. Okay? We're not good enough yet at understanding what a customer is looking for and then serve properly. For me, this sort of shifts the notion of overwhelming choice completely. Right? I can totally agree with this. That makes sense. Choice is good. If I can make a choice on my own, that's fantastic. But I need enough information to make an informed decision, right? I need less noise and more of the information that I'm actually looking for in order to make what's for me a relevant decision, okay? And this, I guess, seriously is one of the, or will be one of the greatest challenges that we will face as we move into this world, right? Like, as we sort of dive into the depths of the long tail, right? Just think of big data, right? It's the same issue. All right. Let me end with this final quote. That's from the book, but he's actually quoting David Foster Wallace. So the quote is this: "Television is not vulgar and dumb because the people who compose the audience are vulgar and dumb. Television is the way it is simply because people tend to be extremely similar in their vulgar and prurient and dumb interests, and wildly different in their refined and aesthetic and noble interests." This is the long tail. All right. Thank you very much for watching. Again, I had some troubles with the length of this book, but I would highly recommend you to check out this book anyway, because the content is really relevant. And if you're somebody who, for example, call yourself an internet entrepreneur, this information is super important, right? So if you're not going to read the book, at least dive into the internet. Figure out what the long tail is all about and figure out how you can monetize. Thank you.